The trauma room smells like antiseptic and decision. Not as a figure of speech. That's the precise combination Lena Williams had trained herself to recognize over years of nights exactly like this one. The sharp chemical bite in the air, the way it cleared everything else out, the noise, the doubt, the weight of whatever had happened before she walked through those doors until only the essential remained. What needed to be done with these hands in this moment. It was a Thursday night in Seattle. Rain outside, as always. Inside, Harborview Medical Center operated the way every trauma center operates at 11 p.m., with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a place that has no patience for drama. The man on the gurney was 43 years old, wearing a $3,000 suit that was now completely destroyed, and carrying an internal hemorrhage that needed to stop within the next 20 minutes or it never would. Lena didn't know his name yet. It didn't matter. Pressure's dropping. 80 over 50, said the nurse to her left. I know. Lena didn't look up. Get me 2 units of O negative and somebody get the surgical center on the line because this man is going to the table in 8 minutes. The man, Jerome Fairley, billionaire, CEO of Fairley Systems, the architect of AI infrastructure deployed across 42 countries, opened his eyes for the first time since they'd come through the sliding doors. Dark eyes, disoriented. But already, even through the haze of blood loss, searching for something to hold on to, something he could control. Where? The word came out raw, scraped. Don't. Lena said it without looking at him. You're at Harborview. You have a lacerated spleen. I'm going to operate right now and you're going to be fine, but I need you to stay still. I need my phone. Lena stopped. She looked up for the first time. She looked at him the way she looked at things that genuinely surprised her, with a kind of careful clinical curiosity, as though she were cataloguing a rare and unexpected specimen. You just asked me for your phone. I have a 7 a.m. meeting with Tokyo. A beat of silence, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that fills a room the way water fills a held breath. You have a meeting with my scalpel in 4 minutes. She turned back to the monitor. Cancel Tokyo. He opened his mouth. The pressure dropped to 72. He didn't say another word. Lena had seen it before. That specific brand of man who treats his own mortality like a scheduling conflict, who lies bleeding on a gurney and reaches instinctively, not for comfort or for someone he loves, but for leverage. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't even denial. It was something older and more stubborn than either. The deep cellular belief that the world runs on his timeline, and that the world, including his own failing body, simply hasn't gotten the memo yet. The surgery lasted 94 minutes. Lena came out of the OR with her gloves still on, peeled them off in the hallway, and walked straight to the coffee machine at the far end of the ICU corridor. The only machine in the building that still produced anything resembling real coffee at 2 in the morning, a fact she knew because she'd logged too many hours in that hallway to count. She was halfway through her second cup when the charge nurse appeared. Dr. Williams, the spleen patient is awake. He's requesting to speak with the attending physician. Great. Tell him the attending physician will see him during morning rounds. He says he needs to speak with you now. Everybody needs something right now. Lena took a sip. This is a hospital, not a concierge service. He said he's going to call the hospital director. Lena looked at her over the rim of the cup. He just came out of abdominal surgery. I know. The man has internal sutures. I know. And he wants to call the director. Apparently. A moment of silence. Then Lena set the cup down on the counter and reached for her coat. You know what's almost impressive, she said, pulling it on. Not the money, the energy. Man nearly dies, and he's still got enough fuel in the tank to be difficult. She started walking. That's almost something worth respecting. It wasn't respect, but she went anyway. The room was dark except for the pale blue glow of the cardiac monitor. Jerome was propped against the pillow, with the expression of a man who had been awake too long, brow furrowed, jaw set, eyes fixed on the ceiling, with the concentrated stillness of someone mentally retracing every decision that had led him here, looking for the one he could have made differently. He heard the door. He turned his head. Lena walked in, coat, badge, and the expression of someone who had better places to be at 2 in the morning, which was the truth. You asked to see me, she said. You're the surgeon who operated? I am. He studied her for a moment, not the way men sometimes looked at her in hospital rooms, that reflexive, sizing assessment she'd learned to move through like weather. This was different, more deliberate, like he was trying to reconcile something that wasn't adding up the way he expected it to. You look too young for abdominal surgery. Lena tilted her head just slightly. And you look too young to nearly die from negligence. She pulled the chair out and sat. When was your last physical? Silence. Based on the spleen alone, I'd say you've been ignoring symptoms for at least 3 years. Pain on your left side after heavy meals? That mid-afternoon fatigue you've been chalking up to stress? He didn't answer, which was an answer. You wanted to talk to me, she said. So talk. I needed to know who was responsible for my case. Now you know. I want to be transferred to a private suite with dedicated nursing starting tomorrow morning. You're in a private room. He looked around. It was, in fact, a single occupancy room. Clean, functional, more than adequate. I want the VIP floor. Lena crossed her arms, slowly, with the composure of someone who wasn't angry. She was, genuinely, trying to understand the logic of the man in front of her, the same way she'd approach a puzzling scan or an anomalous lab result, with patience and without much sympathy. Mr. Fairley. Jerome Fairley. Mr. Fairley. She said the name with the same neutral precision she'd use for a medical term she was noting in a chart. You just underwent emergency abdominal surgery. Your vitals are stable, but you require close monitoring for the next 12 hours. The VIP floor is 60 seconds farther from the ICU. A pause. 60 seconds, in the event of a complication, is not an abstract number. Then move the equipment. The equipment stays where the equipment stays. I can pay. No. The word landed quietly without edge. It was simply a fact, stated. You're paying for excellent medical care. That's exactly what you're receiving. What you cannot purchase is the location of my equipment. She stood. Get some rest. Rounds are at 6. She crossed to the door. Doctor. She stopped, didn't turn. What's your name? It was a strange question for a man like him to ask, a man who led with authority the way other people led with a handshake. But there was something in the way he said it that wasn't about information. It was quieter than that. Like a man who had just been told no, clearly and without apology, for perhaps the first time in a very long while, and found himself unexpectedly curious about the person who'd said it. Williams. She opened the door. Good night, Mr. Fairley. Friday mornings in Harborview's surgical wing had their own particular atmosphere. The smell of second-floor cafeteria coffee drifting through the corridor and mixing with the sharp pine of freshly mopped floors, and, for reasons nobody had ever successfully explained, a faint warmth that seemed to come from entirely the wrong direction, like the building itself had its own stubborn logic. Lena liked Friday mornings. They were chaotic in the right way. The flowers arrived at 9:47 a.m., not a bouquet, an installation. 32 stems of white orchids arranged in a glass vase that almost certainly cost more than someone's weekly paycheck, accompanied by a card printed on paper thick enough to have its own weight, bearing the handwriting of a man who had clearly dictated to an assistant, "For Dr. Williams, thank you for saving my life. J. Fairley." The receptionist at the front desk was visibly waiting for a reaction. Lena looked at the flowers for 3 full seconds. Beautiful. She picked up the vase. Send them to the 5th floor. The 5th floor? Pediatric ICU. The kids will love them. The receptionist watched, mouth slightly open, as Lena walked away down the corridor with 32 white orchids cradled in her arms like they were a stack of patient charts, already thinking about something else entirely. He showed up at 11, not as a patient. He'd been discharged earlier that morning, sooner than anticipated, because his vitals were those of a man who refused to be sick for a single moment longer than was medically unavoidable. He arrived in his own car, in a suit, not the destroyed one from Thursday, a new one, dark charcoal, wearing it with the posture of someone who needed anyone watching to understand that he was here on his own terms. The receptionist recognized him immediately. Of course she did. Mr. Fairley, Dr. Williams is in a procedure until... I'll wait. He waited 40 minutes in a corridor chair without once reaching for his phone, which for Jerome Fairley was the rough equivalent of sitting in silent meditation at a monastery in the Himalayas. Lena came out of the procedure room, saw him and didn't stop. She kept walking. Mr. Fairley, you were discharged this morning. He stood and fell into step beside her, which was not a small thing. Lena moved through hospital corridors the way emergency surgeons always do, as though the hallway was perpetually 6 feet too short. I came to thank you in person. I got the message and the flowers. Stunning. Where are they? 5th floor. He processed that for a beat. You gave away my flowers. Technically, I redirected them. She pushed into the break room and went straight for the coffee maker. The kids in the Pediatric ICU were genuinely happy, which is ultimately the entire point of any gesture of gratitude, isn't it? Jerome stayed in the doorway, watching her. There was something quietly disorienting about a person who was not even slightly impressed by you. Not in a performative way, not as a power move. Lena wasn't hostile. She wasn't cold, exactly. She simply operated on a frequency where his name, his title, and the particular gravity those things usually generated in a room produced absolutely no interference. He couldn't quite locate the angle she was working because she wasn't working one. You know who I am, he said. I do. Lena poured her coffee. CEO of Fairley Systems, Forbes billionaires list 6 years running. Married, divorced, no children confirmed in the press. She took a sip. I read the news. And you nearly died from an internal hemorrhage that any routine physical in the past 3 years would have caught. She tilted her head. The money didn't cover the basics, apparently. Jerome said nothing. Lena set her cup in the sink. Thank you for the thoughtful gesture. If you'd like to do something genuinely useful, the Pediatric ICU has a donation fund. Take care of yourself, Mr. Fairley. She moved toward the door. He didn't step aside. Not aggressively. He simply remained in the doorway with the expression of a man recalculating a route that, by every reasonable measure, should not have required recalculating. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger, something closer to the specific frustration of someone who has never once had to revise his assumptions about how a conversation was going to go. Why are you like this? He said. Lena stopped, looked at him with genuine curiosity. Like what? Difficult. A short laugh escaped her. Not the sharp exhale of dismissal, but something more unguarded than that. The sound of someone who has been caught genuinely off guard by the specific word someone chose. I'm not difficult, I'm direct. Most people confuse the two because they've spent their whole lives surrounded by performed politeness, the kind that smiles at you and means something else entirely. She crossed her arms. Did you save my life, Mr. Fairley? A pause. No. I saved yours. So the dynamic here is fairly specific. She held his gaze for one steady moment, not unkind, not cruel, just unambiguous, the way a good diagnosis is unambiguous, before she stepped past him into the corridor. Enjoy your recovery. He stood in the hallway for a long moment after she was gone. The corridor moved around him. Nurses, a rolling medication cart, the distant double beep of a monitor somewhere down the wing, and he stood in the middle of it, like a man who had walked into a room and forgotten for the first time in recent memory exactly what he'd come for. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, cancelled 2 afternoon meetings, no explanation given. That had never happened before. Daniel Mercer was the kind of man everyone described as wonderful, without being able to produce a single specific example of why. An architect, handsome in an orderly, symmetrical way, punctual, reliable. The kind of person who texted back within the window he'd promised and remembered the birthdays of distant relatives, virtues that the 28-year-old version of Lena had catalogued as non-negotiable, and that the 34-year-old version sometimes regarded with the same quiet puzzlement one feels when rediscovering a grocery list from 5 years ago and trying to remember what exactly one had been planning to cook. He showed up at the hospital on a Tuesday with dinner in a bag and the smile of a man who was completely certain his surprise was going to land. Lena met him at the reception desk. She hugged him. She smiled. Everything correct. Jerome saw it from the corridor. He was there for reasons he had explained to the front desk as post-operative follow-up, a justification that was technically coherent and factually convenient. He was, in fact, just passing through. Or he had been convinced of that until the precise moment he watched the man with the dinner bag pull Lena Williams into a hug in the middle of the hospital corridor, with the easy, unthinking comfort of someone performing a gesture so habitual it had stopped requiring any intention at all. Jerome didn't slow his stride, but he stopped walking for a second. Just 1 second. Then he kept moving, because there was nothing else to do. But the image stayed. Not as a wound, not as something that twisted in his chest the way loss does, more like a document he hadn't meant to open, sitting on his desktop now, impossible to fully close. There was a woman in that hospital corridor who occupied more of his thinking than was reasonable, and she had an entire life, full, established, already furnished, that had been built without a single square foot of space allocated for him. That was simply the fact of it. Jerome Fairley was very good with facts. The scene in the corridor had a specific grammar to it, the language of two people who had long since negotiated all the terms. Lena was saying something to Daniel. He laughed, she smiled, the geometry of them together readable from 30 feet away, as two adults settled inside a dynamic they'd both agreed to and stopped questioning. Comfortable. That was exactly the word. Not charged. Not the kind of energy that makes a person lean forward without meaning to, or choose their words a beat more carefully than usual, or notice for no good reason how someone holds a coffee cup. Just comfortable. Warm in the way that certain rooms are warm, reliable, low maintenance, asking nothing from anyone. Jerome filed it away and kept walking. Later, in the back seat of the car on the way to his next meeting, he sat with his laptop closed on the seat beside him and watched the Seattle rain streak sideways across the window without really tracking any of it. The lights, the traffic, the grey dissolving into grey. His eyes doing the mechanical work of looking while his mind sat somewhere quieter and more inconvenient. He thought, briefly, about what the doctor had said about performed politeness versus actual honesty, about the difference between people who tell you what you want to hear and people who simply tell you. Then he opened the laptop and worked the rest of the way there. That night, Lena brushed her teeth, rinsed, and stood for a moment in the bathroom doorway, looking at the strip of yellow light falling across the bedroom floor. She looked at Daniel's face in the dark, the slow rise and fall of his breathing, the total and uncomplicated peace of him, and found herself thinking about something that made no particular sense, what it might feel like to be looked at by someone who regarded you the way certain people regard an unsolved problem. Not as a burden, as something genuinely worth the effort of figuring out. Someone whose attention had that particular quality of focused, unrelenting interest, like a light that doesn't waver. She didn't know where the thought came from. She didn't examine it. She just noticed it the way you notice an unfamiliar sound in a house you know well. Present, inexplicable, gone before you can place it. She turned off the light. There's a specific kind of comfort that functions as an answer to a question you stopped asking years ago. It doesn't demand anything. It doesn't unsettle you. It fits the shape of your life without friction, and for a long time that feels like the definition of right, until something comes along that unsettles the whole equation, and you realize, standing in a dark doorway in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday night, that you can't quite remember the last time you felt genuinely, inconveniently awake. He came back on Thursday, this time without flowers, without gifts, without an elaborate medical pretext. He arrived at 3 in the afternoon and told the receptionist he had a question about the medication prescribed at discharge, which was true enough to function as a reason. Lena saw him in a small consultation room, the same one she used for quick follow-ups. A desk, 2 chairs, a window with a view of the covered parking structure, and the rain working steadily against the concrete below. "The medication," she said without preamble. "What's happening?" "Nausea in the mornings. Expected side effect for the first 2 weeks. Take it with food." "I take it with food. With actual food. Not coffee and a croissant." He was quiet for a moment. "You guessed the coffee and the croissant." Didn't guess. She made a note in his chart. It's written on the face of every 40-year-old executive who spent a decade confusing being busy with being healthy. Jerome watched her write. There was something specific about the way Lena occupied a professional space, the complete absence of self-consciousness, none of the slightly performed efficiency most people layer over themselves when they know they're being observed. She wasn't managing how she came across. She simply existed inside her work, the way certain people exist inside a language they've spoken since childhood, without accent, without effort, without once thinking about it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're asking me one right now. A different one." She looked up from the chart. "Why emergency medicine?" He leaned back slightly. "With your training, you could have gone anywhere. Cardiac surgery, neurology, better hours, more prestige, better money." Lena set her pen down. "Better money," she repeated slowly, turning the phrase over like she was testing its weight. "It's a valid criterion. For some people." She leaned back. "I like emergency medicine because nobody who comes through those doors has had time to rehearse. You arrive, you're in pain. I need to help. It's clean. It's honest." She tilted her head. "Would you have asked a man that question?" "Probably not." Was that too honest?" It was refreshing. She picked up the pen again. Most people would have said no just to seem better than they are. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Not the silence of two people observing professional distance, not the silence of a doctor and a patient with nothing left to discuss. Something had shifted, barely perceptibly, the way a room's atmosphere changes when someone opens a window, the pressure adjusting before you've consciously registered the difference in the air. Jerome leaned forward slightly, without fully realizing he was doing it, his body making a small decision his mind hadn't signed off on yet. "What do you want?" he said. "Not professionally, personally. What do you want that I couldn't buy?" Lena looked at him. The question was too direct to be small talk, but too genuinely curious to be a move. She held it for a few seconds, not the silence of someone searching for an answer, but the silence of someone who already has it and is quietly deciding whether this particular moment, this particular person, has earned it. "To keep being surprised," she said finally, "by a conversation, by an idea, by a person. Have I surprised you? You asked me for your phone while you were bleeding internally." She closed the chart. "That counts." He laughed. Not the measured exit ramp laugh of a boardroom, a real one, short and unguarded, arriving a full beat before he could do anything about it, the kind that escapes before the careful, composed version of a person can get there first. Lena looked at him with that cataloging expression he was beginning to recognize. "You smile differently when you're not trying," she said. "How do you mean?" "Better." The word dropped between them with a lightness neither of them had engineered, small, specific, and somehow impossible to walk back. Jerome held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly professional. Then, "You're engaged?" "I am." He nodded once, not the nod of a man processing new information, but of a man confirming something he'd already quietly mapped out. He looked at her the way he looked at things he intended to understand completely. "Does he surprise you?" Lena paused. The question had a precision to it that put it in an entirely different category from casual conversation, not a grenade thrown carelessly, but something placed with full awareness of exactly where it was pointing. "Sometimes," she said, with the careful honesty of someone who refuses to lie but isn't willing to say everything. Jerome didn't nod this time. He just looked at her, and the looking itself was the problem, because it wasn't polite looking, wasn't professional looking. It was the kind of looking that takes inventory, slow, unhurried, like he had already decided she was worth the time it took to see her correctly, and he wasn't going to rush it for anyone's comfort, including hers. Then he said very quietly, "You know what I think." He didn't wait for her answer. "I think you spend your whole day being the most awake person in every room you walk into. I think you notice everything. The thing people don't say, the word someone chose instead of the right one, the moment a vital drops before the monitor catches it." He paused. And I think you go home at night to someone who has never once looked at you and felt genuinely, uncomfortably lucky. The room was very still. You should be surprised every day down, he said. Not sometimes, every day, by someone who finds you. A pause, deliberate, unhurried. A problem worth losing sleep over. Lena didn't move. She was aware, with an uncomfortable and precise clarity, of how little space existed between her side of the desk and his. Aware of it, the way you become aware of a sound in a quiet house, something you can't locate and can't stop hearing. Her hands were flat on the closed chart. Her pulse had made a small, unauthorized decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds, and she was not going to acknowledge it. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat too long. Then she stood. "Keep taking it with food," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. She walked out of the room with the clean, deliberate stride of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. She thought about what he'd said for the rest of the afternoon, through a consult, through a laceration repair on a 14-year-old who'd fallen off his bike, through the end of her shift and the drive home, and the dinner Daniel had reheated and left on the counter with a note that said, "Back at 9, meeting ran long." She thought about it at midnight, with Daniel's breathing slow and even beside her, the room dark and perfectly quiet, and completely, suffocatingly familiar. One phrase kept circling back, the way a song does when you've stopped trying to remember it. Someone who finds you a problem worth losing sleep over. She stared at the ceiling. Daniel hadn't lost a night's sleep over her in 4 years. She knew that. She had known it for a long time, had filed it away under the category of things that are true but not useful to examine too closely. What she hadn't been prepared for was someone else seeing it, seeing her, the specific unedited version of her, and naming it out loud with the same calm certainty he'd used to state a fact about the weather. She closed her eyes. It took a long time to fall asleep. The accident happened at 2:18 a.m. on a Friday, a multi-vehicle collision on the I-5, dense fog, 9 cars, the kind of wreck that happens in slow motion and ends all at once. 17 people were admitted to Harborview in the 40 minutes that followed. Lena was called out of sleep. She was on call and arrived in the ER with her hair still faintly damp and that specific state of total immediate alertness that only exists in people who have trained themselves to wake up already running. Jerome was on the 12th floor. Fairley Systems kept an office in a commercial tower 2 blocks from the hospital, a geographic coincidence he had noticed and not mentioned to anyone, and he'd stayed late finalizing a board presentation. When he finally left, the rain was heavy. His car was 4 levels down in the parking garage, and through the wet glass of the lobby doors, he could see the emergency lights of the hospital, strobing red and white against the low ceiling of clouds. He should have gone home. He went to the hospital instead. He didn't enter as a patient. He walked through the main lobby with the visitor badge he still had from his last time there, and followed the movement in a mass casualty event. Any hospital becomes as much a logistics operation as a medical one. Patients waiting for triage, families arriving disoriented, still in the clothes they'd been sleeping in, still carrying the specific bewilderment of people yanked without warning from one version of their night into a completely different one. Gurneys needing direction. People standing lost in the corridor asking questions nobody had time to answer. Jerome was, at his core, a man who organized things. Within 20 minutes, he had positioned himself as an unofficial relay point between the reception desk and the waiting area. Speaking to families in the measured, unhurried tone of someone who understood that information, delivered calmly, is its own form of care. He told them what could be told. He directed the ones who needed directing. He stood in the middle of a corridor operating at full emergency pitch and functioned simply as a point of stillness. Lena saw him at 3:12 a.m. She came out of a trauma room to request additional supplies, turned into the corridor and stopped. Jerome Fairley, tie loosened, sleeves pushed to the elbows, was crouched slightly to meet the eye level of a woman in her 60s, speaking slowly, one hand gesturing with patient precision toward the far end of the hall where her husband had been taken. He wasn't performing reassurance, he was just being clear, giving her something solid to hold on to in a night that had gone completely liquid. Lena stood there for a moment that ran longer than she intended. Then the corridor shifted, a gurney coming fast from the left, someone pushing hard, and Jerome's hand closed around her arm a half-second before she registered that she was standing in the wrong place. She looked at his hand on her arm. He looked at his hand on her arm. Neither of them pretended it was accidental. The gurney passed. The corridor kept moving around them, urgent and indifferent, and they stood inside it for 2-3 seconds that were not even slightly neutral. The kind of seconds that don't announce themselves, that arrive quietly and leave a mark anyway, that you find yourself returning to at odd hours for reasons you'd rather not examine. "You're here," she said. "I was passing by at 3 in the morning. I stayed late at the office." She looked at him, at the loosened tie, at the expression of a man who had just spent an hour helping strangers who had nothing to do with him, and looked, not depleted by it, but steadied, like it had given him somewhere to put something he'd been carrying. "You helped the families," she said. Not a question. They seemed lost. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then something in her face shifted, not dramatically, barely enough to name. The millimeter of relaxation that happens when a professional expression releases its hold and something more unguarded moves through in its place, brief and unplanned like light through a gap. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do anything that—" "You did." She said it directly. Without the humor she usually kept between herself and the world. Without the deflection. Just the words, plain and meant. "You did." His hand was still on her arm. Neither of them had moved. The noise of the corridor continued around them. Monitors, voices, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. And inside all of it they stood in a pocket of stillness that belonged only to them, and both of them knew it, and neither of them reached for a reason to explain it away. It was Lena who stepped back first, not with urgency, not with the brittle quickness of discomfort, but with the slow deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what they're doing when they create distance. A conscious choice made carefully, the way you close a door you're not yet ready to open. "I should go home," she said, "probably. Rain's bad." "I know." But he didn't move. He stayed in the corridor a few minutes longer, until she disappeared back through the trauma room door, until the door swung shut behind her, and the brief specific gravity of her was replaced by the ordinary noise of the hallway. And then he walked back through the lobby the way he'd come in, out into the rain, and stood for a moment on the wet sidewalk before his driver pulled around. He had the distinct, faintly unsettling feeling of a man who has just understood something he wasn't ready to understand. Not a revelation. More like a door he'd walked past 100 times suddenly having a handle. He got in the car. He didn't open his laptop. Back in the trauma room, between a laceration repair and a consult she was already late for, Lena became briefly, inconveniently aware of the exact place on her arm where his hand had been. Not a ghost sensation, just an awareness. The simple, stubborn fact of it. She noted it the way she noted anomalous data, without judgment, without immediate interpretation. She filed it away. She kept working. She thought about it at 4 in the morning. In the 30-second pause between patients when the corridor went briefly, unusually quiet. Thought about the way he'd looked crouched next to that woman in her 60s, unhurried and completely present. Thought about 2 seconds of stillness in a hallway moving at full speed around them. Thought about a hand on her arm and the way neither of them had pretended. The problem wasn't what had happened. The problem was the specific inconvenient weight of what hadn't, and the way that absence occupied more space than most things that had. Daniel didn't ask directly. He was the kind of man who never did. Not out of fear, but out of a genuine, architectural belief that explicit conflict was evidence of prior communication failure. By training and by temperament, he approached the world as a designer. Problems had identifiable causes and applicable solutions. Unresolved emotions were to him what incomplete project briefs were to everyone else. A structural problem, not a human one. Something to be corrected at the source, not excavated in the middle of a Sunday night. But he noticed that Lena was quieter. Not sad, she was never visibly sad, had never been the kind of person who wore her interior weather on the surface. But there was a new quality to her stillness. A subtle repositioning like furniture moved 2 inches, nothing missing, nothing broken, everything exactly where it was supposed to be, and yet the room feeling unmistakably different to someone who knew it well. She answered when spoken to. She shared meals when her schedule allowed. She slept on her side of the bed. But there was a half-second delay in her responses that hadn't been there before. A faint elsewhereness in moments when she used to be completely, simply present. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening, after dinner. "Are you okay?" he said. "I'm fine." "You seem far away." "I'm tired. It's been a heavy week." He looked at her for a moment, the careful, patient look of a man taking measurements. "Is it the patient? The executive?" Lena looked up from her tea. "What?" "I heard Janet at the front desk mention he'd been back a few times." Daniel had the tone of a man presenting data, not leveling a charge. Calm, reasonable. The tone that was one of the things she had loved about him once, and that tonight, for reasons she didn't want to examine, felt like a wall dressed up as a window. "Is it professional? Completely?" "Lena." "It is completely professional, Daniel." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen held its breath around them, the tick of the oven cooling, the faint sound of rain starting again outside, the particular silence of two people in a small space who have both just said less than they mean. Then he stood, carried his plate to the sink and said, with his back to her, "Sometimes you look at me like you're trying to remember something." Lena said nothing, because it was true, because a denial would have been so easy to produce, so clean and practiced, and she was too honest for easy things, had always been, even when honesty cost her more than the lie would have. So she sat with the truth of it, let it take up the space it needed, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. Daniel went to the bedroom. She stayed in the kitchen with her tea going cold in her hands, the ring on her finger carrying a weight that was different from any weight it had carried before. Not the comfortable, familiar weight of a choice already made, but something newer and less welcome. The weight of a question she hadn't been asking, suddenly refusing to stay unasked. Not guilt, not yet. Something that came before guilt. The quiet, arriving clarity of a woman beginning to understand that there is a difference between choosing someone and continuing to choose them. That the first is a moment. That the second is a decision you have to keep making, consciously, every day. And that the moment you stop making it consciously, you're no longer really making it at all. She thought about Jerome in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, standing still inside all that noise, his hand on her arm, and neither of them pretending. She thought about Daniel's face just now, the careful, even expression of a man who had clocked every frequency of her absence and said nothing until he couldn't anymore. Both men, in their own way, were paying attention. The difference, the one she didn't want to look at directly, was what that attention felt like. One felt like being seen, the other felt like being inventoried. She set the mug in the sink. The tea was completely cold. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the rain come down on the street below, doing the thing she was very good at in every context, except this one, trying to diagnose something she wasn't sure she wanted a name for yet. Jerome called on a Wednesday afternoon. Not the hospital, her cell phone, which she had given him in the context of post-operative follow-up, a context that both of them understood, was now wearing thin as paper. "There's a place in Fremont," he said, "right on the canal. Good food, quiet. I'd like to take you to dinner." Lena was silent for 3 seconds. "Is this a medical request?" "No." "Then it's not professional." "It's not." Another silence. "I have a fiancé," she said. "I know." "Then you understand that I can't. Can I ask as a friend?" His voice had something different in it, not the composed authority of the CEO, not the dry armor of his usual irony, something underneath both of those things, something that had stopped trying to sound like anything other than what it was. Just dinner, good food, honest conversation, nothing beyond that. Lena stood at the window of her office and watched the Seattle rain do what Seattle rain always does, fall without apology, without urgency, like it had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to get there. She should have said no. She went. The restaurant was exactly what he'd described. Small, sitting at the edge of Lake Union Canal, dark wood tables worn smooth from years of use, the kind of low light that makes everyone look like a better version of themselves, and the rain working against the windows in a steady, unhurried rhythm that made the inside feel warmer by contrast, like the weather itself had conspired to make leaving feel unreasonable. They stayed 2.5 hours. They talked about things that had nothing to do with the hospital, about Seattle. She'd grown up here. He'd arrived at 26 with a company of 5 people and an idea that changed how hospitals processed clinical data, something she had noticed months ago and hadn't mentioned until tonight. He looked at her when she said it, a quick, unguarded look, the look of someone unexpectedly caught, and then smiled into his glass. They talked about what each of them had sacrificed for work and whether the math held up over time. He admitted that his marriage had lasted 3 years and ended because he had never once, in any of those years, managed to be genuinely present. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way someone talks about a structural mistake they've fully diagnosed and mostly forgiven themselves for. She said nothing about the engagement. He didn't ask, which was a form of consideration she registered and filed away without comment. Lena laughed, a real one, at 9:38 p.m. Her story about a board meeting that had collapsed in a spectacularly absurd way, and the laugh came before she could do anything about it, unguarded, unfiltered, the laugh she kept for people she wasn't performing anything for. Jerome went quiet for a moment, just looking at her, with the expression of a man who has just seen something he wasn't expecting and wants to make sure he's seeing it correctly. "What?" she said, still smiling. "Nothing." But he was smiling too. "You laugh differently when you're not at work." "How do you mean?" "Better." The word landed between them with the full weight of its history. Her word returned to her, precise and deliberate. The same word she had used weeks ago in a small consultation room, with rain against the window, when she'd watched a real laugh escape him before he could stop it. Lena recognized it. Jerome watched her recognize it. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Not the silence of 2 people being careful, not the silence of professional distance holding. This was the silence of 2 people who have just simultaneously run out of ways to pretend the conversation is about something other than what it's about. They had drifted closer during the course of the evening, gradually, incrementally, the way tides move, without either of them registering the specific moment it happened, and the distance between them now was too small to be accidental and too charged to be ignored. Jerome turned his face toward her. She didn't pull back. His eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, brief, almost imperceptible, there and gone, and then returned to hers. The kind of look that doesn't pretend to be something else. The kind that asks a question without making you answer out loud. "Lena." His voice came out low, not the low of a man pressing forward, but the low of a man standing at a door and waiting. The sound of someone who has decided that if this is going to happen, she is going to be the one who opens it. She knew what he was asking. She knew her answer. And still she stayed, for a moment that stretched beyond what was reasonable, held there by the specific gravity of 2 adults at the exact edge of a line neither had crossed, feeling its presence the way you feel a drop in temperature before the storm actually arrives. The warmth of him, the stillness, the particular quality of being looked at by someone for whom she was, clearly and without performance, the only thing in the room worth looking at. It was her who moved back, slowly, without drama. "I need to go." The words came out level. She was grateful again for that. Jerome didn't push, didn't reach for her with a word or a look or a reason to stay. He just watched her stand with that expression she'd seen before, the one that catalogued things quietly, that stored them somewhere careful, that didn't ask for more than what was being offered. "Okay," he said. Lena picked up her coat, paused for a moment with her hand on the back of the chair. "It was a good night," she said. It was. She walked to the door. She got to her car, sat down, put both hands on the steering wheel, and stayed there for 2 full minutes without starting the engine. The rain hit the roof in the steady, indifferent way it always did. She closed her eyes. She thought about what had happened, or more precisely about what had almost happened, which was a different and heavier thing entirely. She thought about his expression in the moment she'd pulled back. Not disappointment, not pressure, something more careful than either of those. The expression of someone who understood exactly where she was standing without requiring her to explain it, draw a map, or apologize for it. She thought about all the times she had stepped back from things she wanted because the timing was wrong, or because a more responsible version of the choice existed somewhere nearby, or because she was, at her core, a woman who trusted her own clinical judgment about everything, every vital, every scan, every anomalous result, except, apparently, herself. And she thought about the difference between responsibility and fear, about how they could feel identical from the inside, about how she had spent years being proud of her restraint without once asking whether restraint and avoidance were, in her particular case, the same thing wearing different clothes. She didn't arrive at an answer. She opened her eyes, started the car, and drove home through the rain. Daniel was on the couch with his laptop when she came in. He said, "Hey," without looking up. The apartment was warm and orderly, and exactly as she'd left it. Dishes done, throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch, the small, accumulated evidence of a life that was well-maintained and quietly, persistently comfortable. He went to bed early. She stayed in the kitchen with a glass of water until midnight, standing at the counter, not drinking it, just holding the glass in both hands and looking at the surface of the water the way you look at something, when you're not really seeing it. When what you're actually doing is listening to your own interior, waiting for it to tell you something you already know and aren't ready to say out loud. Almost. That was the word that stayed with her. Not what had happened, what had almost happened, and the specific inconvenient weight that almost carried. Almost was supposed to be the safe option, the responsible one, the one you told yourself later that you were glad about, but almost didn't feel like relief. It felt like a door she'd walked away from in the dark, and the longer she stood in that kitchen, the more she could still feel the handle in her hand. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. Lena had come home from her shift, carrying the kind of exhaustion that doesn't respond to coffee, the kind that settles into the shoulders and the base of the neck and simply lives there, a dull, accumulated weight that belongs less to the body than to the specific toll of being responsible, for hours at a stretch, for other people's lives. She was in the kitchen heating up food. When Daniel came in from the office with that particular tension she had learned to read over the past several months. Not quite anger, but the pressurized stillness of a man who has been holding something for too long and has finally, quietly run out of room. "You had dinner with him," Daniel said. Not a question. Lena set the spoon on the counter. "With who?" "The patient, Fairley." She said nothing. "Janet saw you leaving with him last week." He stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times and had found, standing here now, that he didn't like any of the versions. "You said it was professional. It was dinner, with a man you operated on who kept coming back to the hospital without any real medical reason. He had medical reasons." "Lena," his voice climbed slightly, "stop treating me like I'm stupid." She turned to look at him. "I don't treat you like you're stupid. You treat everyone like they're less intelligent than you." The words came out at once, with the velocity of something that had been building pressure behind a wall for a long time and had finally found the crack. "You do it to me. You do it to your patients. You do it to everyone you meet. It's exhausting. And the worst part is, you don't even see it." Lena looked at him, not with anger, with something colder and more final than anger. The specific, irreversible clarity of someone who has just seen something they cannot unsee, like a diagnosis that reframes everything that came before it, that makes the previous picture suddenly completely legible. "Daniel, you think you're better than everyone because of the work, because of how much you sacrifice." His voice wasn't cruel, it was tired, which was worse. The exhaustion of someone who has been trying to reach a person through glass for longer than he should have kept trying. "But you're never actually here, not really, and now you're getting distracted by some wealthy patient because apparently what I offer isn't interesting enough." The kitchen went silent. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed. The food on the stove gave a single, small bubble and went quiet. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the bedroom. She opened the drawer, took out the small box where she kept the ring during her shifts, She placed it in her palm and stood there, not crying, not shaking, just looking at it the way she looked at things she needed to understand fully before she could decide what to do with them. The diamond caught the grey afternoon light coming through the curtain and held it, indifferent and precise. She put it back in the box. Not on her finger. In the box. She set it on the dresser and stood there a moment longer, her hand still resting on the lid, and what she felt wasn't grief, not exactly. It was the strange, vertiginous sensation of a woman who has just stopped pretending and found the room quieter than expected. She went to the living room and sat on the couch, while Daniel made the sounds of rearranging things in the bedroom. The specific acoustic language she had learned to translate over 4 years. Drawers closing with slightly too much force, hangers being shifted with unnecessary deliberateness. The sounds of a man waiting for her to come and say she was sorry. She didn't go. At 10 p.m. she went to the bedroom, took a pillow, and returned to the couch. She lay there in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let the apartment be exactly as quiet as it was. Didn't fill it with her phone, didn't fill it with plans or diagnoses or the forward motion she usually used to outrun stillness. Just lay there and let herself feel the full specific weight of a life she had been living slightly beside herself for longer than she wanted to count. She was still awake at 3 in the morning. In the morning, Lena made coffee. When Daniel came out of the bedroom, she looked at him with the clear, steady eyes of someone who had finished thinking and arrived in the night, at the other side of something. She spoke quietly, without drama, without tears, the same voice she used to deliver difficult diagnoses, the voice that meant, "This is true, and I'm not going to make it easier by softening it, because softening it would be a disservice to both of us." "I don't think we should continue." Daniel looked at her. "Because of him, because of me." She set her cup in the sink. She kept her eyes on his, not flinching, not apologizing for the steadiness, because the steadiness was the only honest thing she had to offer him right now. "I should have said this sooner. It was cowardly of me not to." He was silent for a long moment. The apartment held everything it had ever held between them. 4 years of Sunday mornings, of parallel routines, of a life assembled with care and genuine goodwill by 2 people who had confused compatibility with the thing that compatibility is supposed to be in service of. Then he picked up his keys, his coat, and walked to the door. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe," she said honestly. "But I won't regret being honest." It wasn't a closing argument. It wasn't a declaration. It was just the truth, plain and unadorned, the only currency she had ever really trusted. The door closed. Lena stood alone in the kitchen with her coffee going cold. She reached into the pocket of her pajama pants. She had slept with the ring there, for reasons she wasn't prepared to examine too carefully, and placed it on the counter. She stood looking at it for a while. The stone caught the morning light the same way it always had. The ring was exactly what it had always been. Nothing about it had changed. What had changed was her. She didn't feel relief, not immediately, not cleanly. What she felt was the specific gravity of an irreversible decision you know was necessary. Not lightness, but something in the same neighborhood. The particular stillness of a woman who has stopped moving in a direction she knew for a long time was wrong, and who is standing now in the sudden quiet of that stillness, learning what it feels like to be, simply, where she actually is. She hadn't ended it because she'd found something better. She'd ended it because she'd found her way back to herself, to the woman who didn't do things halfway, who didn't stay in rooms she'd quietly outgrown, who had spent years diagnosing everyone else's condition with unflinching precision, and had finally, in a kitchen on a Sunday morning, turned that same precision inward. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. She didn't call Jerome, not because she didn't want to, but because there was something important in letting a few days pass first, in confirming, without any external pressure, that the decision was entirely hers, not a reaction. Not a door opened because another one had closed. Just a woman alone in her apartment for several quiet evenings, taking the full measure of something she had done, and finding that it didn't collapse under examination the way decisions made in motion sometimes do. She worked, she slept, she ate alone and didn't mind it. The apartment felt different without Daniel's particular presence filling it. Not empty exactly. More like a room after furniture has been rearranged, the light falling in the same places but landing differently. She moved through it without performing anything for anyone, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she recognized herself in it. When Jerome appeared at the hospital the following Thursday, she didn't pretend to be surprised. "You're here," she said in the corridor, coat on, between one patient and the next. "Passing by," he corrected mildly. She looked at her left hand. He looked at her left hand. The ring wasn't there. Lena watched his face in the moment he registered its absence. Something moved through his expression, careful, contained, the deliberate stillness of a man holding the correct response in both hands and making sure he had it right before he let it out. "Come on," she said. They went to the small meeting room at the end of the corridor, the same one where she did follow-ups with the window looking out onto the parking structure and the rain and the wet concrete below, grey and steady as always. She closed the door. "I ended the engagement," she said. Directly. No preamble. Jerome looked at her. "Okay," he said slowly. "It wasn't because of you." She crossed her arms, not defensively the way people cross their arms when they're protecting something, but with the composed deliberateness of a woman making sure the architecture of this conversation is exactly right before anything else gets built on top of it. "I need you to understand that. I understand. It wasn't a decision made around any expectation of what might happen between us. I know. I don't know what happens now. Neither do I." The silence that followed was honest, not uncomfortable, honest, which is a different thing entirely. The silence of two people who have agreed, without saying so, to stay inside the truth of the moment rather than reach for something easier. Lena looked at him with that cataloguing expression he had come to recognize as the face she wore when she was being completely, unguardedly real. "You're not," she searched for the word, "excited. Should I be?" Most men would be. "I don't find excitement in someone else's pain," Jerome said plainly. "This is going to hurt someone you chose once. That's not something worth celebrating." Lena was quiet for a moment. There was something specifically disorienting about being with a person who consistently refused to respond the way you braced for. Not frustrating, disorienting. The way it feels when the ground changes texture in the dark and your body has to recalibrate mid-step, catching itself before it was ever in danger of falling. "What do you want?" she said. The same question he had asked her weeks ago, in this same room, with the rain doing the same thing against the same window. Jerome looked at her for a long moment. "Time," he said. "No rush. No assumption that one thing automatically leads to another." He tilted his head slightly, and there was something in the gesture that was different from his usual precision, something more open, like a door left ajar rather than held closed. "You just came out of a relationship, and I am—" He made a brief, vague gesture toward himself, with an irony she hadn't heard from him before, quieter and more genuine than his usual variety. "I know who I am. I'm not a straightforward bet." Lena gave a short, surprised laugh. The unguarded kind. The real kind. The kind that escaped before she could calibrate it. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." "Probably." She uncrossed her arms, stood there for a moment in the grey afternoon light. "All right," she said finally. "Time." Jerome nodded. They stayed in the room a few seconds longer, two adults in a hospital meeting room on a rainy Seattle afternoon, no grand declarations, no easy resolution, the distance between them still present but carrying a different quality now. Not the distance of something being withheld, the distance of something being handled with care. Then he left. She stood at the window for a moment after he was gone, watching the rain move across the parking structure in slow grey sheets, and let the conversation settle in her the way good diagnoses settle, not with noise, but with the quiet authority of something that has named a thing correctly. What stayed with her wasn't what he'd said. It was what he hadn't. He hadn't promised anything, hadn't sketched a future or positioned himself as the answer to a question she'd been asking. He had been honest, specifically, deliberately honest, about who he was and what that cost, about the absence of guarantees, in a conversation where nearly every other man she had ever known would have reached instinctively for the best available version of himself and put it on display. He had offered her the real version instead, unpolished, unoptimized. Here are the complications. Here is the history. Here is what I know about myself and what I don't, and I'm not going to dress any of it up for you, because you're not the kind of person who would trust it if I did. There was something in the specific weight of that honesty that was harder to dismiss than any declaration could have been. Declarations were easy. Declarations cost nothing. This had cost him something. She could tell by the way he'd said it. The slight opening in the irony, the gesture toward himself that wasn't quite comfortable. He had shown her something real. And the thing about being shown something real is that you can't unsee it. She went to her next patient, but the conversation stayed, sitting quietly at the back of her mind, the way certain things do, not loudly, not urgently, just present. The way the first cool day of autumn is present, not dramatic, not asking for anything, just unmistakably, undeniably there, marking a change in the air that you already knew, on some level, was coming. 3 weeks. Seattle stayed gray and wet. The kind of persistent, committed rain that stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like atmosphere. Like the city itself had decided this was simply the appropriate backdrop and wasn't taking notes on anyone's preference. Lena worked. She slept in the apartment that was entirely hers now. Daniel had collected his things on a Saturday while she was on shift, by the unspoken agreement of 2 adults who understood that presence would have made something already difficult into something unnecessarily painful. She hadn't rearranged anything yet. She wasn't ready to, and she'd stopped pretending readiness was the same thing as strength. She hadn't spoken to Jerome in those 3 weeks. She hadn't planned that. It had simply happened. Organic, unstrategic silence. Like 2 people breathing at different rhythms who find, without discussing it, that they've quietly synchronized. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he appeared in the corridor outside the surgical wing. No pretense this time. No flowers, no medical justification, no carefully constructed reason. Just a man in a dark blue suit, standing in a hospital hallway with his hands in his pockets, and his posture slightly less engineered than it used to be, like someone who had quietly stopped rehearsing his entrance. Lena came out of surgery and stopped when she saw him. "You're here." "I was in the neighborhood. At 3 on a Tuesday. The office is 2 blocks away." "It is," she agreed. A beat. "It's been 3 weeks." "I know." They looked at each other across the corridor, and there was no tension in it, not exactly. Something with more density than tension. The specific weight that exists when 2 people have processed something honestly and come out the other side to find it has held. "Do you want coffee?" she said. "You're off?" "I have 40 minutes. They went to the second-floor cafeteria, the one with the mediocre coffee that Lena drank without complaint, because it was 30 seconds from the surgical wing. They sat at a small table by the window, with the rain doing its reliable work on the glass. The conversation was easy. Not the performed ease of 2 people who found a safe topic, the real ease that exists on the other side of difficulty, when 2 people have already seen each other in complicated moments and discovered that what's underneath is something they can actually rest in. He told her about the board presentation. It had gone well, which had surprised him more than it should have. She told him about a case the previous week that had broken unexpectedly in the right direction. One of those rare moments when medicine surprises you. A story she hadn't told anyone else because it felt sentimental, and she didn't like feeling sentimental. Jerome listened, not the listening of someone waiting for their turn, the full, unhurried attention of someone for whom she was, simply, the most interesting thing in the room. "Will you come back?" she said at a certain point. "Here?" "To the hospital." Without a medical reason. He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the cafeteria window and caught the grey in his eyes, and he looked, and for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who wasn't managing anything. Just present. Just here. "Is that an invitation?" "It's a question." "Then yes," he said, "I'll come back." Lena nodded, not with performance, not with the bright punctuation of someone broadcasting how they feel, but with the quiet honesty of a woman acknowledging something she actually wants. Small, unambiguous, real. She stood, reached for her coat. "Jerome." "Lena. You still haven't bought whatever it is you think you want from me. I know." And for the first time the irony was completely gone. No armor, no precision, no careful management of how he came across. Just a man of 43 in a hospital cafeteria being entirely honest. "But I'm not trying to buy it." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest, that careful, clinical, well-defended thing she had been carrying around for years and calling self-sufficiency, shifted, quietly, without drama. The way foundations shift, invisibly, fundamentally, and all at once. "Okay," she said. She pushed through the OR doors. Jerome stood in the corridor on the other side of the glass. She didn't look back immediately, moved through the familiar ritual of the scrub room, the gloves, the controlled breath before the work begins. Then at the door, in a gesture she hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed, that arrived from somewhere below intention, she turned her face slightly. He was still there. She smiled, small, unguarded, the kind of smile that has no audience in mind, that exists only because it can't help it. The rarest kind, the kind that costs something and gives it freely anyway. The door closed. She went back to work, to the warm pressure of surgical gloves, to the clean, decisive sound of the monitor, to the smell of antiseptic and everything that needed doing. Jerome stood at the glass a moment longer. He looked at her silhouette moving inside the OR, the white coat, the sure and unhurried precision of her hands, and felt something he hadn't been prepared to feel and didn't have a boardroom word for. He had spent 43 years believing, in the practical and functional way, that very successful people believe things, that everything worth having had a price, that the right offer made correctly to the right person at the right time would open any door. He had been right about most things. He had been wrong about this, because the thing on the other side of that glass, the thing that had kept him coming back to a hospital corridor in the rain, cancelling meetings without explanation, standing at a cafeteria window with terrible coffee going cold in his hands, had no price, had never had one. And the longer he stood there, the more certain he was that that was exactly why he couldn't stop thinking about it. He turned toward the elevator, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jerome Fairley walked out of a building with nowhere urgent to be and found, to his own quiet surprise, that it felt exactly right. The end.